What's up, guys? It's Damp. So let's talk about the German tanks now that we've kind of walked you through the American line and what that looks like. So, couple generalizations about the German tanks. As you can see, I haven't played the German tanks a lot. Most of the research I've done has been on forums and just from feedback from other players that I've played with, and some of the clan feedback that I've gotten. And a lot of my friends play the German tanks, so a lot of this information is going to come from them, and they'll actually be talking to you in some of the videos later on about what they found and some of how they feel that they would recommend this playstyle going. So to start, there's a ton of tanks to choose from, as you can see. I think this is probably the most plentiful country as far as when it comes to tanks. The American line's close. I think the Russians fairly close, but I think the Germans have the most tanks to choose from, in my opinion. Might not be, but it sure as hell appears from. Just kind of looking at the amount of tanks. So they're known really for their accuracy. This, in my opinion, is one of the best countries to start with as far as a starter country. I feel that their armor, generally speaking, is above average. They're really accurate tanks. You can play a lot of the mediums and the tank destroyers from a distance, as a lot of people like to play that sniper type class in a lot of video games. This is probably one you could consider. Their accuracy makes them really fun to try and pick at some of those places of those pieces of armor, those little structures that maybe in some of the other countries you can't really hit that gun turret or the little plate, the glacis plate underneath. You can't hit that because you're not accurate enough. This is a country that would probably be for you. Some of the disadvantages is that these pretty much are fairly heavy. I think their tier 10 Maus is like one of the heaviest tanks in the game. I mean, it's a fucking bruiser. Look at that thing. That's massive. But anyway, I think it's one of the heavier tanks, if not the heaviest tank in the game. So they are heavy. Now, an advantage to that is if a tank's heavier, you can use it to ram. So even their lighter tanks, if they're heavier than the other light tanks, just run them into them and you can at least do some damage. They do tend to have pretty good frontal armor, and even some of their side armor on most of their tanks, generally speaking, is good too. Because they are heavy, though, that does make them less agile, and sometimes they're slower to the fight. And for you, that means it's less XP to get if you're not going to be able to spot as well, or you're not going to be able to, get to the action and be able to do as much damage as quickly. But because they are so accurate, they can do damage from behind. So in my opinion, if you're stacking like view range on some of these tanks, it benefits them much better than some of the other countries that have less accurate guns. So as we look at, let's start with the light tanks. So if you look at some of the lighter tanks, their lighter tanks tend to have some sloped armor. Like as we look through here, a lot of the light tanks are kind of boxy, but as you look through, let's look through these lights here. So as you look through them, they have lighter armor or more sloped armor, and even if they are heavier and they're a little bit slower, they can still deflect shots. As you see, some of these guys have some sloped armor that maybe is not as prevalent in some of the other light tanks that you see throughout the game, but generally they're pretty good as far as sloping in comparison to like this Lego car that the Czechs have. Like, I mean, this thing is ridiculous. If you look at this, if I can show you it, actually may have already sold it. Yeah, I sold it. Can't show it to you, but like you look at some of the Lego cars that are out there at some of the first, or Lego tanks, some of the first few levels, and you're like, what the hell is this? I'm gonna get crushed, and you do. So that's one advantage to their light tanks. As far as other advantages, I mean, they do okay with their firepower. I would say they're average. As far as their armor goes, being a light tank, they're never going to be really well armored, but they're probably some of the better armored. They're above average through most of at least the lower to mid tiers. So if we look at the medium tanks, which is really where this line is fun. So if we go to some of their mediums, the Panther series, in my opinion, is probably one of the most fun to play. I don't have a lot of experience with it on this account, but on my other account, I can tell you it's really fun to play. Really, really fun to play. It's got a really accurate gun, and you can play it from a really, really, really far away. I think if you're newer to medium tanks, and you're newer to overall in general just the game, that medium line, as far as the Panther series, they have some long-range guns. Their armor in the front is pretty good, and it would allow you to really see the game and really try and learn the game fairly easily. So in my opinion, that's the way to go if you're newer and you're just trying to play a medium tank. The other line's the Leopard line, which is, that one's okay too, but it's going to take a little more experience. If you look at the Leopards, as you go down the line, the Leopards, they're just not, they're more mobile, but in my opinion, they're a lot less fun to play because you can't be back where, you know, somebody can't see you can shoot someone. That's just always fun to play in a game. So looking at the heavies, they're heavies again. They're really heavy. They're probably some of the heaviest, if not the heaviest in the game. But they are, again, they're accurate. Unfortunately, being accurate in a heavy line doesn't benefit you nearly as much as it would if you were in a medium line, where you could stay back some. They're, unfortunately, with some of the heavier German tanks, that plate, the Glacius plate that's underneath. So if we look at this tank right here, we'll go to the T-29 just to kind of show you in the American tanks. These plates underneath here on the German tanks tend to be really, really weak. So if you're playing a map with hills and you see a German tank coming over it, you can do a ton of damage to most of the German tanks because that plate's really weak. But overall, they're good starter tanks to start with. You can do some damage from a distance if you're in a lower tier versus a higher tier as a support class. But again, they're heavy. They're going to be... That line's going to be something that's going to be a challenge if you are trying to get to the action. You want to be first to the fight. The two different lines they have are you have the Maus line, which is the which is the one that's really heavy, and then the E100, which is something that's a little more agile. In comparison, I think if you were to look at the Maus, it's going to give you more health and have a little bit better armor all around. They really have the same type of cannons. So anyway, that's a breakdown in general of the heavy tanks. Now, if you look at the tank destroyers, this is probably the most fun tank destroyer line to play, in my opinion. Same thing, it's on my other account, but generally speaking, because they're so accurate, they can play far away and snipe and really have a distinct advantage over a lot of the mediums and heavies in open maps where they can just sit down and hide. The Jagged Panzer line, as far as the tank destroyer goes, this line here, the Stug is amazing at tier 4 and 5. I think it's OP. It's so armored. But going down the Jagged Panzer line, they're like the snipers. You can sit and wait with them. They have pretty good guns on them. And I'm going to slaughter this, but if we look at, you know, the Hummel line here, I would try to pronounce the rest of those, but in Sprechen Sie Deutsch, I do not. Looking at that line, this is something that is similar to the French. So if you're familiar with the French line, a lot of the French tanks are they're fast reloading, and they're really more, I think they're more of an advanced one to play. They're really like I don't want to say like a glass cannon, but if you were to compare it to World of Warcraft, it's something that, you know, something that doesn't have a lot of armor, but their guns are really big and they do a ton of damage. So anyway, so that's just a general breakdown of the tank destroyers. As far as the SPGs, we can be brief with the SPGs. In their lower tiers, they're pretty accurate, just like everything else. In the higher tiers, I would say consider them middle of the road. But in their lower tiers, they're a lot of fun to play. So again, if you're trying to try out artillery and you want to just change up your game, I would say try the Germans. They're pretty accurate. They do have to move a little bit more than the Americans, who we just talked about. They're pretty mobile, which allows them to shoot and then move. But then again, if you're shooting and moving, that's taking time away from when you could be aiming at another target. But they are a little mobile and agile, which is a little bit of an advantage in the middle tiers. So that's a breakdown of all of the German stuff, guys. So hopefully that helped you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.